Welcome to American Medieval, a podcast about the fact that if the United States has never been truly modern, it's probably because we've always been a little bit medieval. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriel, and I've been researching, teaching, and talking about the Middle Ages, well, to anyone who will listen at least, for more than 3 decades. Each week on the show, we'll be joined by an expert scholar who'll share their fascination with, and sometimes their revulsion by, both the medieval world itself, as well as the ways the historical period has been remembered and used right here in the USA. Hello and welcome everybody back to another episode of American Medieval. I am delighted to be joined today by Benjamin Saltzman, who is an associate professor of English at the University of Chicago, where he co-edits the journal Modern Philology. Ben is also the author of the books Bonds of Secrecy, Law, Spirituality, and the Literature of Concealment in Early Medieval England. And more recently, a book that has just been released, I believe, by the time of recording, by the time this will air, have been long out. The book is called Turning Away the Poetics of an Ancient Gesture. So welcome, and thanks for joining us, Ben.
Thanks, Matt. It's really good to be here.
Fantastic. So longtime listeners of the show will know that we like to start things off with perhaps a silly question. So I'll beg your indulgence on this one. So, the question involves time machines, as I'm sure you probably already know. Maybe you're already prepared for this by now, which is weird that people actually listen to the show, but that's another whole kind of episode or conversation separately. Anyway, so the question involves time machines, and it is a single-use time machine, importantly there and back, so you don't have to stay wherever you're going. But the caveat is the only way that time machine can be used is you, Benjamin, have been presented with this time machine. You have to go back and tell a younger version of yourself, a young Ben, that you will someday grow up to be a medievalist. How does young Ben react to that news?
Gosh, I thought where you were going to go with this is more of a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court kind of.
Oh yeah, I love throwing curveballs here. Yeah. So.
If you could go back to the Middle Ages, would you? Right.
The answer to that is definitely not. But
yeah.
Anyway.
Well, I'm not sure I'd go back to what age did you ask me to imagine myself as?
This is up to you, and this is an important kind of data point for my sociological study of medievalists that I'm conducting here. So yeah.
If I were to go back to my teenage years, I would have had no idea that this is where I would wind up or be doing. I was fully occupied with skateboarding and surfing, and that was what was on my mind.
Okay.
It really wasn't until I was in college that a series of events kind of steered me in this direction, and looking back, I can't imagine it kind of going any other way.
Mm-hmm.
So I did my undergrad in New York at Pace University, a small school in downtown Manhattan. And I was planning to study law and political science, and I was really interested in constitutional law and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I ended up enrolling in a course that I didn't realize I had enrolled in, and was looking at my schedule and kind of frantically trying to find the room where this course was taught. But of course, I had the wrong information, right? So I ended up getting the correct information, but I was running late now for the class, and I walked into the classroom, and I was probably 10 minutes late or so. And the professor, Michael Schuyler, still remember him distinctly because he had such a huge effect on my future. Mm-hmm. He was an adjunct professor in New York, teaching a bunch of different places, studying film, really trying to get into a PhD program and just working so hard at this. And I walk into the classroom and he says, "There's always someone who does this. Never be late to my class." I'm just shocked. I'm shocked in this moment, and had to write everyone had to write a diagnostic essay, and I was terrible at writing, and also very frazzled. And I sit down to write this, and I write this terrible essay, and he graded it really harshly. I think gave me a D and was like, "This is awful, terrible." But it sparked something along with his teaching. It really sparked a kind of interest and a commitment on my part to work hard in this class. I ended up writing a paper on Ibsen's Peer Gynt that I was really excited about. And by the end of the quarter, wrote this paper on Beowulf.
Okay.
Which was, not in his area of expertise at all.
Yeah.
But he, had great things to say about it. And then we worked together on it. And then he introduced me to Martha Driver, who was the medievalist at Pace University.
Mm-hmm.
And she was excited. And she introduced me to Hal Moma, who is the Old English scholar at at NYU. And at the time, this is like 2005, 2004 in New York, and Hal Moma and Patricia Daly and Kathleen Davis and Stacy Klein, they had formed a consortium of Old English studies in the New York area.
Okay.
And they invited me to attend a kind of graduate student presentation workshop sort of thing. And just, it was so cool. I was like, I want to do this. I want to be a part of this. And from there, I just, kept participating, kept taking classes, kept learning. And that was the kind of moment where I remember calling my parents and saying, you know how I told you a few months ago that I was going to drop out of college and go to culinary school? Well, guess what? I'm going to study Old English.
All right. So skater, surfer to chef to literature professor, medievalist. There you go. So, all right. A couple questions here I have to follow up on. First of all, do you still skate?
Occasionally. I've taken up like a surf skate kind of thing, but I can't get off the ground anymore.
Okay. I asked because nobody can see this because, again, this is an audio medium here, this podcast, but I'm significantly older than Ben, and people my age have started taking up skating again. So maybe that's like a midlife crisis thing, or it's probably, for certain people I know around here, it definitely is a midlife crisis thing, but some other people just have never stopped skating. So I'm curious about kind of that path.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like the risk reward is the impact on your life if you were to break your wrist, especially in our line of work. To break a wrist would be pretty devastating.
Absolutely. I think so. I played soccer a lot when I was younger, and I kind of stopped when I got to a certain age. Part of it was because it took me so much longer to recover from playing a soccer match, in which it used to be like the next day I was sore or something like that, and then I was sore for like a week, and I was like, I don't think this can do this. I also, because it's a small town, and this is probably oversharing, but this is what podcasts are for, is oversharing. I started playing against some of my students.
Oh yeah.
And I realized I just don't want to do this, because if they tackle me or if I tackle them or something like that, like, it's going to be real awkward in the classroom the next day. So the second question is, well, it's more of kind of an observation, but also kind of a question, is that, you were asking kind of about what age did I mean? And people seem to be very kind of split on kind of what I mean by that. Oftentimes it's kind of very early teens, or it's sometime kind of late around like beginning of college or something like that. And those seem to be kind of the formative moments where a path is kind of set. And when it's kind of that, your experience of just having a really good teacher, a professor who opens up and shows you that, hey, this is a possibility. The life of the mind, study of languages, of texts, of things like that, that's something you can do, can be incredibly transformative. And it so often is, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we owe everything to our teachers and our mentors. And that's, there's nothing more important than that in terms of setting a kid's direction.
Yeah, and it can happen in a variety of different ways, from, a high school field trip to a middle school kind of engagement experience to like a college class. So
or just someone who recognizes your potential or your interest, and then takes an interest in you and cultivates you as a person, and helps you cultivate yourself. Yeah.
And it seems to be particularly important, in this day and age when we are all at the university and in all levels of education kind of confronting the specter of AI, right? Is that disembodied attempt to kind of mechanize learning, which takes away that kind of human experience, those little conversations that can really happen, not just in a classroom, which happen in the classroom kind of all the time, but those moments kind of afterwards, right? In which you ask, like a student asks another question and you get to have a conversation with them and actually kind of get to know them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's becoming increasingly rare, but it's so important, those human connections, spending time in office hours. I always say that, I say to my students, that's the way to hack college or whatever. It's just like connecting with your professors. They're there waiting for you to, reach out to them and have a conversation. And you don't need to know what you want to ask in advance of that conversation. You can kind of like this podcast, right? you can just show up and have a conversation, and you have no idea where it's going to go, but it might totally transform your life.
Yeah. 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 Like this podcast, like you said, like who knows what's going to happen? God knows, right? So we're flying blind.
Now
here.
I'm worried. No.
Yeah. Well, you should be. Yeah. So I'm a nefarious, notorious, incisive question asker. like, do you still skateboard? That's the level of my conversation. But back to office hours too. Like if students are listening, let me just like, this will be my plea. Like, please come visit your professors at office hours. Like, we don't do anything while you're there except wait for you to show up. So, and oftentimes you will distract us from having to answer an avalanche of emails. So it is a delight when you walk in that door oftentimes. And so please come see us, even if it's just to sit down and ask a question or just say like, hey, how am I doing in the class or something like that. We would love to talk to you. Anyway, back to the Middle Ages now. So we should talk about kind of the Middle Ages. So your experience kind of was initially, if I'm remembering, way back when, a couple minutes ago, when you were talking about kind of your journey, like your first introduction to the Middle Ages was through Beowulf, or at least, that kind of research project on Beowulf. And you've kind of stayed generally kind of in the early Middle Ages. Your first book was kind of about secrecy in kind of early medieval England and stuff like that. What kind of drew you kind of to Beowulf, which other than it's an amazing kind of poem and super interesting, what kind of kept you kind of in the early Middle Ages? Because oftentimes with English literary scholars, they are drawn to things like Chaucer, and not that you don't do that or anything like that, but there just seemed to be kind of a temporal divide perhaps in literary studies among English scholars, and you tend towards the early part. So is there something particular about that, or was it just kind of a freak of kind of what you were introduced to in college and grad school and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, part of it, I can't deny that part of it was the community that I was just describing, right? Like, just feel that was the community that I was introduced to, and it was, and still is very vibrant. But I think, more intellectually or internally, the thing that interested me in the earlier side of the Middle Ages, kind of two related aspects. One is the language. So, that Beowulf paper this is a really embarrassing story. But
literally tens of people will listen to this on the podcast.
Well, you 10 people can laugh at me. But I was advised to submit that paper for publication, right? Which was which was the kind of highest. But I did this very sophomoric thing and submitted it to PMLA, which is totally insane.
For those unfamiliar, that is like one of the flagship publications in
literary studies, all of literary studies. Mm-hmm. But what's amazing is that they actually sent it out to readers. And the two readers responded and completely condemned. They just destroyed they said, this wouldn't even get a passing grade in my graduate seminar, that kind of stuff. But, here I was, and I received that advice. And the big thing was, you need to engage with the language, the old English text. And I kind of, at that point, had no idea that there was this kind of whole other world underneath the translation that I was reading. And that those readers' comments sent me in that direction. And so I set out, I was like, I need to learn Old English, right? Mm-hmm. So I tried to teach myself Old English. And that set in motion this kind of curiosity about language, about the history of our language. And one thing I didn't tell you in my kind of long self-history was that I grew up in Los Angeles, and I went to a public school, a Spanish immersion school in Santa Monica, that basically every class, except for English class, was taught in Spanish. And I was, by, kindergarten and then through fifth grade or so, I was fluent in Spanish. But then I transferred to a different school and began to take Spanish classes that I failed over and over again because I didn't understand how grammar worked.
Yeah.
And, the exams and the teachers would ask, conjugate this verb. And I'd say, I have no idea what you mean by the word conjugate, right? I don't even really understand what a verb is, right? I just had no sense of how grammar worked. And so I went into studying, and this continued until, high school, and just having an inability to understand, because I had never been taught how English grammar works. Mm-hmm. And so I began to study Old English, and suddenly, in order to learn a language like Old English, you need to know the foundational basic principles of grammar. And so I was stuck. And it was that summer that I enrolled in an intensive course in ancient Greek. And that was, in taking that course, which is, I don't know if you've had an experience with an intensive summer language course like that, or in Latin or something, but you are in a classroom for hours every day, and you're just immersed in learning this language. Mm-hmm. And that was when grammar clicked. And so it was that kind of sense of discovery and learning that really drew me to Old English, because unlike Greek, Old English has, it's like more ambiguous. There's more play. Like in learning Greek, there's an answer to almost, right? It's like there's a kind of concrete answer to any kind of grammatical problem. And it's really, it's well studied and everything. But like Old English, there's still the, 2-volume Mitchell's Old English syntax. So if you have a syntactical problem in Old English, you can find the solution in there. But still, I felt at that stage like you encounter a line of poetry in Old English, and the language itself has so much ambiguity and room for interpretation that I was just enthralled by that. And then relatedly, I was excited by the possibility of just discovering obscure texts, obscure manuscripts. I sort of dreamt of finding a new manuscript of old English. And that, like, in some ways is a very real possibility.
Sure.
The like Sutton Hoo burial was discovered around this time. So there's still this attraction that I have to the possibility of discovering something new and obscure and distant.
Yeah. The puzzle of the language, that's something that could be really enthralling, right? And really kind of entrancing is that, and by puzzle, like, I guess, like you were saying, kind of not necessarily like we don't necessarily know what it means or anything like that, but just the ambiguity in that, the fact that we can argue about like, how do we scan this sentence and how do we understand it? Like, which can turn, the meaning of a poem kind of on its head at times, right? Especially when you're dealing with sometimes smaller fragments. But the reality of kind of the grammar thing, I was thinking about, not just kind of intensive language, but I remember taking my first Latin class in college as well. And like, not that I didn't know what a noun was, but like I kind of didn't know what a noun was, right? Yeah. And like declension, like what in God's name are you talking about? Like this doesn't make any sense to me. So, but then after that, like then the structure of language started to make a little bit more sense, and it made kind of everything a little bit easier. But it was always kind of like a puzzle to be worked out. Like when you're dealing with a text, how is the person there who doesn't have, or in the 10th and 11th century, for example, like doesn't have a grammar sitting in front of them, right? A modern grammar. Like oftentimes they're doing weird and interesting things that we need to kind of puzzle out. I will always remember one of my sources for my dissertation was this 10th century Italian monk who absolutely did not know Latin, but wrote in Latin anyway. And so it was this weird pastiche of kind of proto-Italian vernacular, Northern Italian vernacular, and Latin, which just didn't make any sense to me at all. And I was like, God damn it, I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to figure out what he is talking about. And I think I did. So,
I mean, that's what drives medieval Latinists to become medieval Latinists.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's the draw of the Latin that is
curious.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
That's curious.
Yeah. There is romance to this, but there was not a lot of romance while I was trying to figure it out, and I was a graduate student and needed to.
No, it's brutal. No, because every time that when you discover a kind of exception to the rule, then suddenly you encounter a difficult word and you go, well, maybe it's an error,
Yes.
I've done some work on like cryptography before, and that was the thing that I became fascinated with in medieval cryptography is the way in which what happens when a cryptogram, a word that's been encrypted, say by replacing each letter by the next letter in the alphabet, what happens when the scribe accidentally replaces it with the previous letter in the alphabet? And suddenly, once you start to allow for errors like that, the whole thing kind of falls apart because you encounter a word that doesn't quite make sense. And then you go, well, maybe it's an error.
Yeah.
When we write in sort of regular language, spelling and our kind of spelling conventions and our expectations of how a word should be spelled act as a kind of guardrail against errors in a way. And the same thing I think happens when you're like learning a language like Latin or something, and then you encounter an error in the textbook, which is very rare. But if you think you have, then suddenly all of those difficult sort of problems that you've encountered before or in the future, suddenly you go, well, either I don't understand this or maybe the textbook has an error.
Yeah.
That's a bad state of mind.
The other thing too, right, is that, as you well know, and maybe our listeners are familiar and maybe they're not, is that oftentimes the first encounter that medievalists have with a text is through a critical edition or some sort of edition, in which some oftentimes 19th century kind of German savant, he's always German who did this, right, kind of compiled all the text together and then produces kind of the definitive text, but recently, not super recently, but more recently, scholars have been going back to manuscripts and kind of looking at variants and stuff like that. And then you're confronted with error or choice, right? Which is really kind of bedeviling and at times can be incredibly frustrating, but incredibly exciting as well. So I'm curious too, with your work on cryptography, has that helped you like that kind of mindset and that kind of subject expertise or that kind of subject focus maybe better is has it changed the way that you encounter kind of or think about kind of medieval manuscripts at all?
A little bit. I mean, one thing it made me, there's say 19th century or early 20th century scholarly editions, which we hold up as, it's incredible work.
Oh, yeah.
And there's less and less of it being done, right? And I tend to do maybe more creative, conceptual type scholarship rather than, I couldn't see myself creating a scholarly edition of a text, for instance. But all of that relies on these centuries of previous scholars creating these meticulous pieces of scholarship and these texts that we then read. But we're kind of relying on the accuracy of their transcriptions and their descriptions of, say, descriptions of manuscripts in libraries.
Yeah.
And what's remarkable is a lot of that relied on just a single person's memory. Right? I've seen this handwriting before in this other manuscript when I was in the Vatican, or I've seen this, and it's quite remarkable. I mean, it's I'd say it's on par with AI, right? We've sort of moved away, but these scholars had that ability to kind of digest and process and retain a huge amount of detailed information, references to, source material, right? This is let's say the Bible, right? This passage is a reference to this part of the Bible, right? And that's something that as we've gained these tools that allow us to search text, lots of text all at once really quickly, it's allowed us to see analogies that maybe have never been seen before, say between two texts or language and two texts, and to draw connections. But before that, right, it was based on the memory of the individual scholar. But I guess the thing that I'm trying to get at is just that that's also subject to errors.
Yes.
And that was the kind of cool thing that I found when I was doing this cryptography work, is that oftentimes editors would include these, say a cryptogram written in the margin of a text. In a manuscript, they would include that in the notes to their scholarly edition. But the number of times that if the cryptogram had an error made by the scribe, the editor would often not just reproduce the error, but they would often get the error wrong.
Really?
Yeah, they would try and correct it.
Oh, wow.
And in doing so, they would revert. So again, instead of replacing the incorrect letter with the subsequent letter in the alphabet, they would replace it in the opposite direction and create nonsense in that way, right? So it's just, that's what I took away, is when you're dealing with these things, they're just highly subject to error because you don't have the normal constraints of orthography or spelling.
Because all of this is a choice, right? It's a scholarly choice. And I don't mean that to diminish the work of scholarship. As you were saying, we are still incredibly dependent upon, and these are incredibly valuable tools, the work that our forebears, if you will, we're kind of doing in this period. But at the same time, they were people. They made choices. We are reliant upon kind of the work that they were doing. Sometimes, we're kind of stuck. Almost every medievalist, and maybe this is true for you, it's certainly true for me, is that the only thing that exists now is a scholarly edition or some sort of transcription, because the manuscript's gone. Destroyed in a fire, destroyed at something else, lost, maybe in some private collection somewhere or something like that. So it's not to say that we can't use that stuff, but we do have to be aware that there are people involved in the process of creating scholarship. So
yeah, I like to tell my students that they should see themselves in a kind of long interpretive chain, right? That the text that they're reading in, say, the Norton anthology or whatever is itself based on an edition that made like as you said, right, is the basis of decisions made by an editor, and that itself is based on a manuscript or a selection of manuscripts, each of which was the product of decisions made and errors made by a given scribe in a given context. And so each of those decisions along the way shape the text that you are now reading, or the translation you're now reading, so even one step removed.
Yeah.
And as an interpreter, as a reader, you're then just part of that chain, right? But, to go back to the very beginning of our conversation, this is the thing that's important to realize when studying medieval texts or texts from the past, right? Is that over that long history, a lot can change with a text and how we interpret it.
Yeah.
And the fact is we're interpreting it and we're reading it now in our current climate, in our current context, in our room, in our classroom. And that informs how we understand it. You can't deny that.
No.
Which is why I love your podcast. The idea of the sort of American medieval, right, is like, what does it mean to encounter the Middle Ages in today's America?
Yeah, it depends on the type of medievalism you're encountering and kind of how you're encountering it. And even kind of where you're encountering. You teach at a certain institution. I teach at a different institution. We have students who are, even within that institution, who are coming from all sorts of kind of backgrounds, some of whom may have encountered some of these texts before, many of whom who have not, and how they understand them and how they kind of read them kind of varies. And that's all part of this process of knowledge creation, is working together in order to kind of think through the problems that are associated with a certain type of analysis, but also kind of the possibilities that lay there as well in the classroom. And then kind of, beyond that, as they develop their skills, as we continue as scholars to kind of develop our skills as well. And that long view, this is what's called a transition in the podcast world. And that long view is part of your new work, your new book, which is Turning Away, the Poetics of an Ancient Gesture, just out with University of Chicago Press. First of all, maybe we could start with a really basic question. So, because this book does take a much longer view, it's not just constrained to the Middle Ages, it touches on modernity and it touches on kind of the ancient world well before kind of what we call the European Middle Ages as well. Could you just give us just a really brief rundown of kind of what do you mean by turning away at first?
Yeah, so the book is about the gesture of turning away, of covering one's face, of averting one's gaze, and thinking about what this gesture means from antiquity to the present. And behind my curiosity about this gesture is a kind of pressing question for us today. And that is, why do we turn away from the suffering of others? Why do we turn away in grief? Why do we turn away in shame? What are the different ways that we turn away? And what does it mean when we do it? I think we're always turning away from something, and all the more so now. And I became very curious about what does it mean when we turn away? What does it feel like? And how is it represented? And how is it interpreted? And how is it read? And yeah, you're right. It is a study that grapples with Plato as much as it grapples with the White Lotus.
Yeah, no, there's a lovely second season of The White Lotus, we should say.
Fair enough.
Which I haven't seen, but that's fine. I've seen the first season and I got the idea. No, but there's a lovely vignette too at the very beginning in which you talk about a photograph, specifically of a young Syrian child who is photographed dead. And I remember very distinctly, I know exactly the photograph that you're talking about because it was kind of all over the place very briefly, but then as you talk about, then it was kind of removed from kind of public view. And there was kind of a debate about it. So could you kind of talk us through kind of the debate? Like, all right, so we're starting from this very modern concern is what does it mean to see this type of suffering, right? A child literally not alive on a beach. And then to replace that with the grieving father, right? That became kind of the icon about that. How did that take you from that kind of back into the past? And can we draw lines, which I guess is the bigger question, between something that we're talking about here in the 21st century and, as you were saying, something all the way back to Plato?
Yeah. I mean, the photograph, as your listeners may be familiar, is of Aylan Kurdi. And as I began to write the preface, which was, I think, the very last bit that I sat down to write, I did some reflecting about where was I when I started working on this project? What was I thinking about? And kind of forcing myself to reckon with that. And there were kind of two streams of thought or experience that I recollected. And one had to do with the pictures of the drawings of Adam and Eve in a particular medieval manuscript, which I can talk about in a moment to connect the dots to the present. But then the other was just my own experience as a new father right around 2014, 2016, and recollecting this photograph. It was kind of like vaguely in my memory, but I remember distinctly not only being affected by it myself, but then also just the kind of cultural climate of the moment and the kind of crisis, the media crisis that it produced.
Yeah.
And as I began looking into it, what I found was that it, as you said, it had been replaced by, or the sort of general media consensus was like, we should not be putting on display an image of a dead child on the beach. And in its place, oftentimes was this image of the father grieving. And what was really striking about it was the father was producing the very gesture that my book is about. He was covering his face with his hand in a state of grief. And this, it echoes back to, for me at least, this famous painting by Timanthes depicting Agamemnon and the sacrifice of his daughter Iphigenia. And what makes this painting so famous is that Timanthes painted Agamemnon covering his face with his cloak. And Roman rhetoricians, Cicero, Quintilian, and others, and so many people through the 19th, 20th century even reflect on this painting, and they wonder, well, why did Timanthes cover Agamemnon's face? And the kind of early initial explanation is because the father's grief is so extreme that you can't possibly represent it. The paintbrush is entirely inadequate to the task of the expression that would convey the father's extreme state of grief. So this gesture becomes not only a gesture of grief, but a gesture of the unrepresentable aspect of emotion.
Yeah.
And when I encountered this other photograph, which I had not seen at the time, of Curti's father performing this gesture, it all clicked as like, oh, I understand now why this photograph of all photographs was chosen to stand in for the photograph of the child, because it, in covering the father's face, it leaves open so much to the beholder's imagination and kind of represents or gives us access to the intensity of the moment. And so that's kind of one of the takeaways of the book, is that we often now tend to condemn the act of turning away as a kind of moral failure. We understand, and I think to some degree this is right, but we understand that collective attention is an essential guardrail against atrocity and abuses and corruption. And as a result, we say, don't look away, right? We understand a kind of moral obligation to paying attention.
Yeah.
And yet it's in these moments where you realize, okay, there is a way in which sometimes we turn away. And in doing so, we actually become more deeply engaged with the thing that we are turning away from. And there are all kinds of reasons for this, I think. One of them is that, like, once you turn away, you've already seen the thing that you're turning away from. And so it dwells with you in a kind of powerful way. And then the other thing is just that, like, I think as humans, there are times where we need to turn away and we kind of can't help it. And so my sense is, like, how do we understand that process and how do we recognize that in ourselves? Because there's often something really meaningful and significant happening in those moments when we do turn away or when we do cover our face.
Yeah, it seems to have something to do with analysis too, right? And, maybe this is perhaps an oversimplification, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like the focus on the grieving father or whoever is the person who is turning away is it's demonstrating to the viewer or to the reader, or kind of however the medium is described, is what you're supposed to take from this, right? That this is a moment for grief, for, with your description of the painting, kind of an almost unfathomable understanding of kind of what's happening there, and a way to kind of represent something that's unrepresentable and trying to transfer that to the viewer in that way. Is that what you're trying to say here? Or
I think there's two layers, right? There's the person who is conducting the gesture themselves, right? Who, for them, obviously there are a million different contexts. And part of my point of the book is to show the kind of multiplicity, the varieties of meaning that this gesture can contain. But imagine the case in which one performs this gesture, one turns away in a state of grief. That can be a mode of becoming more proximate to the thing that we've lost, right? Or the person that we've lost. On the other hand, kind of what you're talking about is also what that gesture looks like from the perspective of someone encountering it in a work of art, let's say, or in a film or in a photograph.
Yeah.
And what do we do with that information? And I do think that artists recognize this oftentimes as one of the most powerful gestures in their toolkit for the way in which it provokes us as the viewer, not only to have to sort of speculate and imagine what that person who is covering their face might be feeling or what it might mean, but also then to reflect on our state in relation to the scene that this person within it is turning away from. And here we are, say, looking at a painting, The 3rd of May by Francisco Goya or whatever, where there's an execution taking place. And there are figures within that painting who are covering their faces because they are either terrified or they cannot bear to look or for any variety of different reasons. But here we are standing before that painting.
Yeah.
And I think those figures serve a really, really crucial role in how that painting feels.
Yeah. We all know that guy. You know the one. That guy that sucks. Well, imagine having that conversation, but for history. This Guy Sucked is a history podcast for haters by haters. Join historian Dr. Claire Aubin and a new expert every week to pull back the scholarly curtain on some of the world's biggest bummers. No dead person is safe, and the show's guests prove that the best part of understanding the past is criticizing it. New episodes every Thursday, wherever you listen to podcasts. Is there a kind of mode of turning away that we might see as more positive? Because the ways that you're describing it right now is grief, fear, shame, which I want to talk about shame, in a little bit. But are there other ways of kind of turning away that you experience, for example, like kind of in the pre-modern examples that you use throughout the book, that we could see that as something kind of a little bit different than those other kind of what we might see as kind of more negative experiences?
I mean, I think it generally holds a negative dimension, but there's a way in which it can be a mode of play. For instance, very early on, and I maybe barely touch on this in the book, but very early on, a friend said to me, what does a child do when you tell them to hide, right?
Yeah.
And they'll often cover their face, right?
Yep.
And so I think that there's some room for play in this gesture. But I do think that we generally tend to associate it with negative affects, negative emotions.
Yeah. It seems like, as I'm trying to think about kind of the way that, as we were talking about, not just the way that people physically react to situations to cover their face or to literally turn their bodies or something like that to turn away, but the way that in a world of social media, these things are obviously mediated. So it's not even, we might not even be seeing the images, but we're seeing people react to the images or a performance of turning away, like on Blue Sky or Instagram or something like that. And then we ourselves kind of perform that. So like, it seems like we were talking about kind of a chain of interpretation, like a long line of scholars or something like that. It seems like that's the way that this kind of emotion, this affect can travel as well. Is that fair?
Yeah. And it's worth kind of bearing in mind that in those encounters, say on social media, right, that the technology that we are using to encounter particular sites or film, or not film, but video or documentation of footage of an event that maybe is unbearable, maybe provokes us to turn away. I don't know. But like you're encountering them in a context or through a medium that is itself constantly kind of turning our attention from one thing to the next.
Sure.
And there's a larger scale to this as well, right? Like one new war redirects our attention from a previous war that is taking place, which directs our attention away from a previous war, which directs our attention away from things that are happening domestically or whatever, right? There's like our attention kind of can only be focused in one place at a given time, maybe a couple places sort of bearing in our minds, but the rate at which we move from one scene to the next, I think is unprecedented.
So does this, or at least in the pre-modern sense, like is this a way of actually focusing attention then? Or can this be a way of kind of focusing attention?
I want to resist the tendency to imagine a kind of pre-modern golden age in which attention,
Sure. Yeah,
attention was perfected, or in which turning away was understood or kind of fully harnessed to its great potential or something like that. So I want to avoid that. But certainly by looking at this gesture across the ages, what it's helped me see is that one of the things it does, and this might be the kind of positive sense, is that it's actually oftentimes the mechanism through which we can access our inner thought. It's the way that we can access understanding, even the understanding of another, which requires a kind of self-reflection or processing through oneself. And if our attention is constantly directed outwards, we can't do that.
Yeah.
So I do think that there is a capacity that is enabled through the act of turning away. And that capacity is often, it's thought, it's sometimes unpleasant, right? It's inner struggle,
Sure.
self-reflection, regret, remorse, understanding one's own complicity, right? Like you can't understand your own complicity unless you turn inward a little bit.
Well, we have, I don't know if you saw this recently, is that I believe it was Mark Andreessen who recently gave an interview on a podcast, not this podcast, I will say, but on another podcast in which he said that interiority only kind of happened in the in the middle of the 20th century or something like that. And, which is just a ludicrous statement kind of on its face.
But classic.
but absolutely classic, right? And because I think one of the things that your book does really well is that by tracing this gesture, as you said, right, kind of through the ages, and again, starting in modernity and going all the way back, to the Greeks and, around that time and stuff like that, is that these were people in the past, which is something that I think that, and I'm trying to kind of gather my thoughts here, because I think one of the things that Andreessen's thing that's it's stuck in my head so much is like, he doesn't think that there are other people in the world, because he's not kind of doing this, or he's kind of resisting this. But what interiority actually does for you is allow you to see your place within kind of a larger experience, and that the fact that people were doing this, or at least kind of thinking about these kind of oftentimes traumatic events, like through grief or shame or kind of their experience, that you can see that those people experienced those things in the past. And we are experiencing, not the same thing, but, because context is incredibly important here, but that we're doing these things or performing these gestures now, that people in the past were doing those things and experiencing something that made them kind of fully human in kind of a fundamental way.
Yeah, and I think it gives us a new way of understanding, say, interiority in relation to grief, which, there's never been a kind of denial of the state of grief or the emotion of grief in, as far back as you can go. But I think what changes is when you start to see grief represented by a figure bringing their hands to their forehead and covering their eyes, bowing their head. Like, how can that not be a really profound state of interiority or interior reflection? Another friend of mine just a few months ago kind of pointed out to me something that I hadn't quite also processed. Matt Sergi, I don't know if you've talked with him, drama scholar at University of Toronto, but he said, Ben, like when you bring your hand to your head and you touch your forehead and you cover your eyes, it's a kind of proprioception that gives you access to an awareness of your own self, right? Of your own presence, of your own body, of your own mind.
Yeah.
And so to kind of connect those two things makes you realize, like, oh, when you see this gesture in, say, a work of art or from pre-modernity, you realize that is in fact a gesture of interiority oftentimes. And also, and this is what's really fascinating about this gesture, is that it's also a kind of recognition of one's relation to the outside world.
Yeah.
Right? Because by virtue of trying to block one's access to it. So it sounds sort of contradictory or paradoxical, but it's this really, really remarkable recognition of one's own self, but one's own self in relation to the world, performed through a kind of attempt at blocking or breaking those two apart for momentarily.
Yeah, and then the reaction too. I mean, like I love that description as well, because it reminds you that there are physical bodies moving through space too, right? Like there was touch, like you were touching your own body, you were feeling, we might assume, right, kind of the moisture of the tears and things of that nature. But it is a reminder that the self is a self, and also that there are other people kind of out there that you were, like you were saying, like you're trying to block them out. Like, you have another kind of anecdotes in there about a Syrian doctor from a documentary in which she talks about like not wanting to open her eyes because then it becomes real again. So the reality of that is that trying to shut yourself away, but understanding that you can't. That's a really powerful kind of statement, I think.
Yeah. And that kind of gets at some material that I work with also later in the book, Primo Levi in particular, who kind of has this moment where he reflects on just kind of the state of things being so catastrophic, so catastrophically bad that you can't, in fact, turn away. It's almost as though you anywhere you turn, there is something that is horrific. That's kind of what I took away from that early quotation, that also that sort of resonated with me. And I've kind of kept that with me since the beginning of this project. The idea that this doctor finally has a moment of reprieve by virtue of leaving her hospital behind.
Mm-hmm.
And it's until that point, she had not been able to turn away.
Yeah.
Catastrophically so. And so the moment of kind of finally being able to close one's eyes is really profound. But again, in that moment, it doesn't mean that there's a kind of loss of awareness of what one is closing one's eyes against. In fact, it's a kind of deeper haunting, and it's not an act of forgetting. It's an act of connection.
Yeah, and it seems like an act of like it's processing as well, right? Keeping your eyes open, as you kind of elegantly talk about, that can be, and oftentimes is, to be overwhelmed by the experience that you are witnessing in some way. I do want to shift very briefly, though, because we've been talking primarily about grief, and I'm wondering how shame kind of fits into this as well, because that's obviously kind of a different experience. I mean, gets to interiority and issues of that, but how are grief and shame kind of connected here? That's the question I would start with.
Yeah, so I think there's a particular tradition in a sort of psychology tradition that sees them as somewhat related.
Mm.
And in some ways you could see the relation going back to, Adam and Eve are a kind of key, key figures, not only for understanding our kind of cultural views on shame, let's say, because they're the kind of primordial moment in which shame enters the world and the human experience. But also they get utilized in a way as a kind of model of the experience of shame going forward in a variety of different contexts. It's not entirely separated from grief, because the thing that Adam and Eve experience when they fall is partly a kind of recognition of their mortality, right? And the anticipation of grief that someday you will die and I will mourn you, right? That's new in the mythology of the fall. And then the other aspect is I am naked. And I feel shame in relation to my sexualized naked body and yours.
Yeah.
And so what is the response? And this is the thing that kind of first provoked me to start thinking about this gesture, because I was looking at this famous manuscript of Old English poetry known as the Junius manuscript. And what makes it a really special manuscript is that it contains these Old English poetic translations of the book of Genesis, the book of Exodus, and some other texts. And it's heavily illustrated. There's a drawing on almost every other page or so. And then eventually there are just blank spaces for drawings.
Sure.
Which is just, I find that so eerie and so uncanny to imagine what would have been there had the artists completed their work.
Yeah.
But in these drawings of Adam and Eve at the fall in particular, they are repeatedly drawn covering their faces. And that immediately struck me as weird.
Yeah.
Because we normally see Adam and Eve covering their genitals. And so here it was, a kind of, in my initial reading, was interesting. They're not trying to hide themselves. They're not trying to not be seen. They're trying to not see.
Yeah.
And so why? Why do they suddenly need to not see? And it's because, in some ways, because their eyes have suddenly been opened. They now have access to knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah.
And with that knowledge comes the need to turn away, to cover your eyes. And this manuscript kind of remarkably just latches onto that. And then to come back to shame, it aligns very crazy close to, for instance, Sylvan Tompkins, a mid-20th century psychologist who writes on affect and negative affects in particular. And he has this definition of shame that is essentially when you kind of try to stop looking at something but kind of keep looking, but also you don't want to be seen looking, right? So it's this like you want to see, you don't want to see, but you don't want to be seen
seeing.
And when you sort of transpose that experience onto, or that definition onto these images of Adam and Eve, you go, oh my God, that's exactly what you're doing. And then you look even closer and their fingers are in these particular drawings, their fingers are spread apart so wide that they can kind of see through them. And so it's like they're trying not to see, but they can kind of see through them probably. The fingers are also characteristic of art during this period. So it's hard to tell, but still it raises the question of to what degree is this shame? But then it's also grief. It's also this kind of anticipatory grief. Yeah. And it's also remorse. It's also, recognizing, damn, what did I do?
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I go back? Right? Can I go back and redo it? I can't.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, the way you're describing it in the way that the illustrator that's decided to produce these images, it just seems like incredibly evocative of really trying to convey a message to make sure that the understanding of what had happened is proper and correct, right? And that we understand kind of what Adam and Eve are thinking at that particular moment, but also too, like kind of going back to what we were saying, it seems also a way of allowing them the space as kind of people to be processing kind of what's happening, to be understanding, right? That confronting it directly, like seeing it directly would be too much. And so they need to be able to have a moment to kind of reflect on and then to be able to understand it in a kind of a different way, but still be able to kind of, like you said, like kind of see through their fingers so they still know what's kind of going on.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a totally new way of seeing the world according to the story, right?
Yeah. So it seems like turning away seems to be kind of necessary, right? Like that's, I think, kind of one of the things that you seem to be saying, kind of in the book is that there's a line that we can draw from today all the way back, because this is a way of kind of dealing with these really important things that we encounter and having a way of kind of thinking with them or thinking through them and still retaining our humanity in some way, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Well, I'm glad I summarized that very well. So anyway, which is appropriate too, because we are unfortunately kind of running to the end of our hour. And so we do have to cut this off. Much more there, obviously, in the book. But Ben, thank you so much for joining us. If people do want to learn more about the book, about you, and I believe you are about to embark on a book tour as we are recording this, where can they learn more about you on the internet?
On the internet.
Okay.
I'm sure that I can be found in some way, either through the University of Chicago or my personal site.
And your personal site is? Now's the time to promote. So
sure, it's just B Saltzman.
bsaltzman.com. Okay, so
.com. Yeah, there you go.
All right, go check it out. There is, I believe, an excerpt from the book available there, and of course, information about all your other scholarship and work. And be sure to look out for that book as it comes out. Again, thank you, Ben, for joining us. Everybody should go check out Turning Away. Think about grief and interiority, and resist anything that tech bros say about the matter, no matter what. So that's my own commentary. There you go. Anyway, thank you again, Ben. Thanks for joining us. Thank you to everybody, too, for joining us for another episode of American Medieval. Until next week, be good or don't. I'm not your parents, and we'll see you all soon. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of American Medieval, a proud member of the Multitude Podcast Collective. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriel, and this episode was edited by Julia Schiffini. The theme song to American Medieval is from the song Sleeping Bags by OTE. If you'd like to support the show, get ad-free episodes, be inscribed into the Book of Life for being a kind and generous soul, and get some other neat bonus stuff, please visit us at patreon.com/American Medieval. Thanks again for listening. See you all soon.